Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the FBOs SafetyNet webinar series. Today's session is the second of 3 from Polaris Aero with Madeline Young, discussing effective FRAT, MRAT, and GRAT, if you will, methodologies to reduce risk. So all of the risk assessments. I am Catherine Hilst. I am the FBO Operations Manager. As the globally recognized voluntary safety standard, FBO helps operators apply industry best practices by challenging them to review and compare their safety-related policies, processes, and procedures, and then make improvements, elevating them to the worldwide standard for business aviation. I just have a few housekeeping items for you before we get started. You all are on mute and will stay on mute during the presentation. However, you have opportunity during the entire presentation to type in your questions, comments, thoughts. There is a questions box. If you type it in there, we'll hold them until the end of the presentation and look at those in a Q&A session. Super excited to have Polaris Aero back today, talking about risk management as a cornerstone of the safety management system framework, under which the key element of risk assessment and mitigation exists. Though the discussion of risk assessments isn't new, our industry moves forward when pre-existing paradigms are questioned and challenged. During this presentation, we'll not only elucidate the need to broaden the applicability of risk assessments beyond pilots, but also examine a modern approach to assessing risk, one that does not involve quantifying risk with a traditional score, but rather discussing hazards when they become relevant. Presented by Madeline Young. She is the product manager for Polaris Aero and is responsible for developing the VOCUS product roadmap and ensuring the roadmap is aligned with customer needs, regulatory requirements, and the Polaris Aero vision. Prior to joining Polaris, Madeline was both a safety and compliance specialist for a large Part 135 operator and ran several related programs, including ASAP for pilots and maintenance. She has experience working in privately owned FBOs in the U.S. Senate and for a State Department of Aeronautics. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Air Transport Administration and recently earned her Master of Engineering in Advanced Safety Engineering and Management. She's also a recreational pilot. Madeline, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. And I will also introduce my co-presenter for the day as well, Chris Connor, co-founder and CEO for Polaris Aero. So he will join us in the conversation here in just a little while. Before I jump right into today's session, I do want to inform everyone about our final SafetyNet webinar of the year. It will be the last week in November. The topic will be about transitioning to a new safety manager or safety officer and some best practices around that, presented by our very own VP of Safety Services, Kelly Roby. So there will be a slide at the end with more information on that. But if you are in that situation or suspect that you might be transitioning to a new safety manager, that would be an excellent webinar for you and your team to join. So now to today's topic. As the title of the webinar states, we're going to be focusing on pre-work risk assessments for pilots, maintenance, and line technicians. So we generally refer to them as ground techs as well. So I do want to set that scope early on because it's very easy to talk about FRATs using that term, flight risk assessment tools. However, if we do use those terms, we also want to broaden that applicability to these other groups of people where it can also be relevant. So just wanted to set that early on. We fully recognize that the emphasis on the risk assessment conversation in the industry has predominantly been focused on crew. However, more and more we are seeing that shift in these other fields, and we're seeing that in conjunction with the rise in attention on safety management systems, of course. We'll get more into that in a little while. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start off with some definitions. And the good news is that by and large, safety management principles are consistent, not only across these industries, so the flight operations, maintenance, and ground, but throughout the international civil aviation network. So while many of these definitions are concepts I'm going to cover stem from flight operations specific references, they are still very much accurate, relevant, and applicable to these other fields that have received less attention in the past, and we're only seeing that gain momentum now. So obviously referring to maintenance in line. So hopefully this presentation will be useful as a reference in that regard. And with that, let's start with our first definition of risk management. So risk management, as defined by ICAO Doc 9859, is the continuous process of identifying hazards, conducting safety risk assessments, developing and implementing safety risk mitigations, and accepting risk. Now, not talking about anything else, just generally, what is risk management? This definition can come off sounding fairly academic, fairly rigid, fairly structured. It may even come off, or you might perceive it as something that would be time consuming. We naturally engage in risk assessment in our personal lives, in our professional lives on a daily basis, and often without putting any name to it, without really realizing that what we're doing is in fact risk management. So for example, in my home state, we're allowed to turn right at a red light with the rules of the road. We don't have to, but it's a very common practice to do that. And for example, if I were to be at that red light and wanting to turn right, I may creep into the turn, but as I do so, I'm constantly observing not only the traffic signals, but the traffic activity, the activities of the sidewalks that might lead into the intersections, etc. Right? There are all these factors that I'm thinking about very instantaneously and subconsciously. And even if I'm considering the distractions in my own vehicle, I might be thinking about, is my daughter crying in the back seat? Is my music too loud where I need to turn it down so I can focus a bit more intentionally, right? I'm conducting this real-time assessment of the situation, considering what mitigation, such as potentially not turning right on red, or potentially turning down the music, or waiting for a larger space between vehicles for me to make my move. It's a fairly straightforward and hopefully a simple example that a lot of you can resonate with, but it's real and it's indicative of these behaviors that we exhibit in our professional lives as well. However, obviously there's a difference between our professional and our personal lives and our approach to risk, particularly in how we view risk management as a whole. And in our personal lives, we often don't view it that way. In our professional lives, there is that emphasis. So though this practice of risk management can still be done subconsciously or very quickly or routinely in the workplace, or it can be done really without understanding what it is that we're doing, such as actually performing a risk analysis, it holds different weight. Our objectives as employees are different than that of just regular individuals in our everyday lives. In the workplace, there's a unique emphasis on accountability, on legalities, on resources, and on the concept of risk complexity in general. And again, these aren't things that we're necessarily calling to the forefront of our minds, calling direct attention to, but the way that we've designed the structure of our environment, the way we've designed our procedures and our best practices all allude to these things: maintaining accountability, operating under legalities, and using appropriate resources. So naturally, we're predisposed to engaging in risk management. It's just a natural thing that we do in the workplace that requires a more sophisticated approach. So moving on, risk management, as we looked at in that definition, is essentially the practice of identifying hazards, mitigating their associated risks, and because of that, it can be really helpful to define the term of a hazard. What is a hazard? What is it that we're actually looking for that can give us information about how we need to talk about and understand risk? And we have two definitions that we can look at. I'm pulling one from ICAO Doc 9859 and the other from the FAA's supporting documentation of 14 CFR Part 5. So if you're in the United States, that might be a document you're more familiar with. So let's look at the first definition. What is a hazard as defined by ICAO? It's a condition or an object with the potential to cause or contribute to the unsafe operation of an aircraft or aviation safety-related equipment, products, or services. So a fairly broad term in that sense. Now let's look at the FAA definition here. a condition that could foreseeably cause or contribute to an aircraft accident as defined in 14 CFR Part 830. You can see the reference there. So I'm pulling these out for two reasons. The first is because I think, in general, ICAO is a very good standard to look at. It is by many regards the standard to look at, but also because for my United States operators, even though this is how the FAA currently is defining a hazard, that it is anticipated that that will change with an impending rule that will be released next year, and the change in that definition will align more directly with ICAO's definition. And by more directly, I mean it will essentially be broadened to include these other considerations such as safety-related equipment, products, or services, right? And one of the intentional reasons behind that is to appeal to a larger masses, not just the flight operations departments. So some other things that we can consider as far as what a hazard can contribute to the unsafe operation of is damage or loss of a system or to a system. Think about property, hangar equipment, the ramp conditions, things of that nature, and then also damage to the environment, something that's not explicitly stated here, but can be applied in the same way. So moving on from this definition of a hazard, so a condition or an object with the potential to cause or contribute to the unsafe operations of or loss of, damage, etc. Let's move on to the definition of a risk assessment. So we define it, if you look at ICAO documentation as well as FAA documentation and some other pre-existing guidance documents that are out there, risk assessments are defined in many different ways. So what I've done here is really just kind of combined and simplified a lot of these different references into one. So a risk assessment in general is a process of analyzing and evaluating the potential risk associated with a hazard. And I want to call specific attention to the fact that we're not talking about the risk of a hazard. We're talking about the risk associated with a hazard, the potential risk associated with a hazard. And the reason that that's important to think about in that way is because a hazard in and of itself out in the world is not by itself risky. It is when you start to consider how it's going to affect your operation. So an example I used years ago is think about wildlife in your local facility, in your local airport environment. Wildlife in and of itself, sure, is a hazard, but until that hazard becomes actualized, until you understand how it can affect your operations and what the potential of that is, such as flying directly over the runway at a low altitude, or wildlife actually crossing the runway, until you consider that application, that's where the risk actually lies, and that's how we can better understand how to manage it. So there is that nuance there, but that nuance is very important. So again, the definition here is somewhat generic as it applies to really any facet of risk management that requires an assessment. So for example, change management, or the management of change, however you refer to that process, is a process through which we would identify hazards as resulting from a change and assess the risk associated with those hazards, right? So the risk assessment applies. In this case, it has nothing to do with a pre-work risk assessment. We're not about to go fly, we're about to manage an aircraft or fuel an aircraft or tow it or do something maintenance related on the aircraft. We're just talking about a general change in our workplace, in our system, that requires risk assessment, right? So that's because the risk assessment itself is fundamentally fairly straightforward and applicable to any scenario in which you would identify a hazard. And one of those scenarios is pre-work, right? Where you want to consider what hazards you identify, and how you can manage them. So change management and pre-work assessments are just two of those ways. There are plenty of other ways that you may go about identifying hazards in which a risk assessment would be applicable. So let's move on to what a risk assessment tool is in particular. So this is where that term FRAT or GRAT or MRAT comes from, right? A flight risk assessment tool, a ground risk assessment tool, a maintenance risk assessment tool. What it really is a safety risk management assessment tool for flight, ground, or maintenance. Now, obviously that's a mouthful. So I'm generally okay with the way that this is termed as just a general risk assessment tool. But it's not just about risk assessment, because if we go back and look at what a risk assessment is, it's a process of analyzing and evaluating the potential, right? It doesn't really specify, the risk assessment definition doesn't specify anything about mitigation. It doesn't specify anything about how you actually go about identifying hazards. So that's why I think that this definition is a bit more fitting for a risk assessment tool, because it talks about, or what it states is it is a tool for identifying conditions or objects with the potential to cause or contribute to the unsafe operations of, and facilitating the analysis and mitigation of risks associated with the potential actualization of those hazards. So the tool in and of itself helps us to identify, to have this method or this path or this tool that actually tangibly helps us figure out what hazards exist, and then facilitates the analysis of and the design of the mitigation strategies to control the risk that's associated with these hazards and how those hazards can actually affect our operation that we are primarily concerned with. So if you're interested more in these technical definitions, if you will, again, ICAO is a great reference, and we'll look at some of those, or I'll show you some of those references later on. But the purpose of me emphasizing this is to show that the way that we conduct risk assessments throughout our entire operation is fundamentally the same. It's fundamentally based on safety management system practices. There's no different way of doing it, right? It's all the same, but the way that you go about it can change. These methodologies that we're referring to, and that's what Chris will get deeper into here in just a little while. So why do we care about pre-work risk assessments? I think a lot of this is very intuitive for us, or fairly obvious, but there are some things that might not be so obvious. And so that's why I want to get into this. I won't spend too much time on it. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence here about why this matters, but I do think it's good to set the tone. So another reason why I want to get into this is because there are other pre-existing processes or tools that some of these different types of departments use. So something like threat and air management, TEM, something like your daily stand-ups before you all start your shifts, or your pre-flight briefings. All of these different tools or practices are great in theory, and I'm not here to dispute any of them. That's not the purpose of our webinar today. But there's absolutely overlap, not only in the goals of these assessments versus these other processes, but also in the way that they're conducted. Again, they loosely follow kind of this risk assessment framework, just without calling it a risk assessment. Generally speaking, in TEM, in daily stand-ups, in pre-flight briefings, you're loosely identifying hazards and trying to mitigate risks associated with how those hazards could affect your operations. You just might not be terming them in that way. So one of the reasons I'm calling attention to that is because if you have not yet designed a FRAT, a GRAT, an MRAT, but you're desiring to do so, there are ways to leverage things that you are currently doing in order to achieve that purpose. It just might require some sort of modification, or maybe for you to actually formalize that process in certain ways. A professor of mine by the name of Dr. Ivan Popility refers to information as the currency of safety. And while information is absolutely critical, making sense of that information has much to do with our abilities as it does with the content of that information, as well as the timeliness of when the information is being presented to us. I'm alluding to some things that Chris is going to touch on in a little while. Okay, so let's move on. Why are risk assessments important? And obviously, it increases safety by provoking us to identify the hazards and manage risk. That's a core fundamental value of safety management systems, right? So that can't be overlooked. It's a holistic approach in that regard. Not only that, but for anyone striving to achieve SMS compliance or standardization, it's critical because it's based on the SMS framework. So if you're trying to achieve or develop a safety management system or achieve some sort of higher standard with SMS, this is a risk assessment is fundamentally important in that. There are also some, could be obvious, maybe not so obvious, some considerations. Think of it in this way. It can help guide us to identify hazards that, generally speaking, may be more challenging for us to otherwise identify. So I'm talking about regulations. I'm talking about conformance with company standards and SOPs. I'm talking about considering your AFM or your equipment limitations, other environmental or situational conditions, the actual health and viability of your aircraft and equipment. All of these things are things that we're probably thinking about in one way or another, but until you actually define what it is that you should routinely be interested in, and have a way of actually ensuring that all of these components are being considered, it's very challenging for us as humans to rely on our memories, on our mental capacity to make sure that all of these things are being touched on. So a risk assessment is a really great way to formalize consideration of all of these different factors. And these are just some of them. It's not complete. One I skipped over there was that third item down, the opportunity for slow work or stop work authority. I think most of us are familiar with stop work authority. The slow work authority I just threw in there, but what I'm really referring to there is giving us the ability through this information that we're receiving from a risk assessment to take pause, to actually internalize and really understand what these hazards are indicative of and determine what these next steps are. Do I need to slow down my work in any way? What mitigations do I need to put in place that might take time? Do I need to stop work? And what this information gives us the ability to do is it allows us to say, hey, here is the information that I have, and it bolsters our ability to go to a higher authority and say, because of these reasons, we can't complete this mission in this way, or something else needs to be done. And then finally, is it provokes dialogue. And we'll get more into dialogue here in just a minute, but essentially, without a formalized risk assessment tool, it would be nearly impossible to consider all these factors like I was talking about. And I'm emphasizing provoking dialogue because it's not just about knowing that you've completed the hazard identification part. It's also about understanding how those hazards can affect your operation, and you might not necessarily know that unless you have a dialogue around these hazards. So there are a multitude of different reasons why dialogue is important. I'm going to share just a couple of them, and I'll try to get through this fairly quickly here. The first one is the component of sharing knowledge and perspectives. So each individual brings their own unique experience, their own knowledge and perspectives to the assessment. And by discussing these various components that are more abstract, that you wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to do, that's what's going to give you these insights that you wouldn't otherwise be aware of, right? So it's this collaborative approach to making more informed decisions, because let's face it, we all have our own knowledge and perspectives, and without those conversations, we're not going to become more aware of them. It also gives us the ability for redundancy and cross-checking. So in aviation, it's very commonly known that redundancy and cross-checking are fundamental principles of safety. By having multiple people involved in the risk assessment process, there's this built-in system for cross-checking information and decisions. It reduces the likelihood of or the potential for omission of information or incorrect information to inform your decision making. Which brings us to decision making. Risk assessments often involve making critical decisions. And by often, I mean when a risk assessment is indicative of a hazard that has high potential for a negative outcome, if you will, critical decisions need to be made, such as whether to even proceed with the mission or how it needs to be adjusted. These decisions have a significant impact on safety. So the dialogue allows for collective decision-making where crew members can discuss the available options, weigh the risks, and reach a consensus. They can go about this decision-making as a team. The next is stress and cognitive bias mitigation. In high-stress situations, such as those that we encounter, individuals can experience cognitive bias and tunnel vision. Discussing the risk assessment openly allows a team to identify and mitigate these biases in particular, and ensure that more comprehensive approach and evaluation of risk. Communication and CRM. This probably doesn't need any more emphasis, but nonetheless, I just wanted to bring it up here because effective communication is a cornerstone of CRM, and CRM is generally applied to crew in the cockpit, but the principles of it can be extrapolated for these other teams as well in maintenance and line operations. Enhanced situational awareness. Engaging in dialogue allows us to collectively improve that situational awareness. It means everyone has a better understanding of the current conditions, potential risk, and overall context that the operation is involved in, whether that's the flight, whether that's the context around maintaining an aircraft or moving around on the ramp. And then building up of the team and cohesion, building up of psychological safety, building up of your safety infrastructure, building up of your culture, right? Collaborative risk assessments foster that teamwork and cohesion among these individuals. And with time, that starts to build up this sense of psychological safety. It breaks down these barriers that otherwise would have pre-existed that might inhibit someone from being more vulnerable in the way that they talk about risk. And lastly is compliance, right? In many different ways, there are, regulations and protocols and standards that actually set out requirements for communication and coordination among crew members specifically. Again, it might not be as straightforward for maintenance and line personnel, but it can still be applied in that way. And following those regulations and standards is, of course, critical. So this just provides a very clear-cut way in how you can achieve compliance for having structured communication among team members. So moving on, regulations, standards, and guidance around risk assessments. As you might have picked up from what I've been putting down about risk assessments over the last several minutes here, there isn't a whole lot of structure around risk assessments and the requirements for them or when they are required by and large. However, there are some references that we can look at that do scope out what risk assessments should look like if they were to be applied. So for those who are not familiar, at a very high level, ICAO Annex 19 essentially consolidates all SMS standards and recommended practices across all of the annexes dating back to 2013. And it outlines the requirements for state safety programs across all of these different regulatory authorities that have to or are, I guess, underneath this ICAO umbrella because of the United Nations affiliation. So with that being said, ICAO Annex 19, Chapter 3 states that states shall require certain service providers under their authority to implement SMS. Now, Chapter 4 actually outlines what those SMS requirements are, and in Annex 19, Appendix 2 is where we actually see the framework around safety management systems, where safety risk assessments and mitigations actually lives. So that would be component 2, element 2.2. So if you needed the reference for that for whatever reason, there it is for you. That specific element does have some text behind it, and that text essentially reads as: the service provider shall develop and maintain a process that ensures analysis, assessment, and control of the safety risks identified with hazards. It doesn't say specifically how or when you identify those hazards, just that when you do, there is this process behind it that you need to consider. So there's a lot of flexibility there. I'm not going to get too deep into ICAO Doc 9859, but this is the reference that I pulled several of the definitions from earlier. So if you want to go look up those references for yourself, this is the reference for you. It's a safety management manual for states to basically oversee safety management implementation under their authority. Two last slides here before I kick it off to Chris. And the first one is that remember that IBAC, assuming that you're affiliated and have access to their portal, they do have an SMS toolkit in addition to their standards and the protocols and the supporting documentation that they provide. There are other SMS toolkit resources that can help you get started with some of this risk assessment best practices. And then, of course, we're not diving deep into the regulations today because this, isn't intended to be specific for United States operators. It can be applicable, hopefully, to anyone that falls under that ICAO umbrella. So I just wanted to call attention to that because your specific regulatory authority may have more requirements around this that we're just not getting deep into today. So with that being said, let's get into these methodologies that we're talking about. We generally are categorizing these as a traditional methodology and our next generation methodology. And Chris is going to talk about both. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to him.
Yep, thanks, Madeline. As Madeline stated, there's many different ways to assess risk, but I think we have to think about broader questions. What makes a risk assessment effective? And to be effective, risk assessments need to do two things. The first one is it needs to increase our knowledge. In other words, it needs to tell us something we don't know or are not familiar with. And the second thing it needs to do is it needs to facilitate action, right? It has to help us do something to mitigate that risk. If we do these two things, then we can call those risk assessments effective. So what I'd like to do now is look at the most popular way of assessing risk, which is the FRAT tool. And this document is actually derived from an FAA information for operator 07015. And this is just a screenshot of it. And I think everyone is familiar with how it works. What we do is we basically assign numerical values to various hazards. So for example, a wet runway is assigned a value of 3. These are then added together to get an overall score. The higher the score, the higher the risk. And this is a pilot example, but the same methodology applies to maintenance and ground personnel. So once again, let's look at the effectiveness part. What does it do? Two things. One, does it increase our knowledge? Does it tell us something we don't know? And I'd say no. I mean, I knew there's a thunderstorm because I checked the box. What if something I was not aware of? And the second thing is, does this FRAT facilitate action? Does it tell me what I need to do to mitigate that thunderstorm risk? Does it tell me to avoid thunderstorm by 20 nautical miles? Does it tell me what my turbulence penetration airspeed is if I happen to get caught in the thunderstorm? And the answer is no. So that's a big shortcoming to the FRAT. Now, there is a positive thing about the FRAT. Listing the hazards that you're going to encounter facilitates dialogue, and that is a good thing. That is one of the positive things about using this. The problem is assigning those arbitrary numerical values to these hazards. And there are 5 hidden dangers I'd like to discuss in using the FRAT. The first one is it's based on a pre-flight perception, right? What do you think you're going to encounter before the flight? And as we know, perceptions are not necessarily based on reality. It's based on the pilot's knowledge and experience. And the second hidden danger with the FRAT is a knowledge assumption, right? We assume that the pilots have the knowledge and experience to, once again, identify the hazards. And number two, we assume they know what to do about those hazards. This is a picture of the wreckage of a Challenger crash in Montrose, Colorado that killed 3 people. Now, what's interesting about this is the pilot took off in icing conditions without de-icing the aircraft. Now, the pilot had 10,000 hours and 7 type ratings. So based on our traditional way of doing things, we assume that that pilot should have understood those hazards. But when the NTSB looked at his logbook, what they found was he didn't have the relevant experience flying in those winter weather conditions. So our assumptions were invalid. And the third hidden danger with using hazard scoring system or FRATs is the awareness paradox. Using a numbering system, a less experienced pilot actually faces a lower risk than a more experienced pilot. So for example, if a brand new pilot walks outside of your hangar and sees a thunderstorm, they look at their little FRAT tool and they see thunderstorm has a 5, and that's the only thing they identify. 5 is a low number, therefore they consider it low risk, they're good to go. But now let's view that same hazard, the thunderstorm, through the lens of a more experienced pilot. When that more experienced pilot sees a thunderstorm, he or she sees all the embedded hazards within that thunderstorm, right? Gusty winds, wind shear, icing, tornadoes, lightning, etc. And when they add all those hazards up, they realize that this is really a no-go. So we need to be aware of the awareness paradox. The fourth hidden danger is a trending trap, which is the mistaken belief that by trending this information over time, we're somehow gaining insight as to the risks our organization is facing. So for example, once again, this is from the FAA's numbers. Let's assume we're going to do a pop-up trip, which is a short notice trip, and we're going to fly in twilight. If these are the only hazards we identify, like we said, we add them together and get a score. And if we do this for every flight, and we encounter basically the same types of hazards, we can trend this information over time. And when we look at this aggregated information, we see that it falls within a certain range, and it appears that our organization is low risk because it's low numbers on our FRAT scores. But let's go back to the original FRAT once again and take a closer look. This 5 represented a pop-up trip and twilight. But what if it represented something totally different, like severe icing? Right? Is it still considered low risk? And the answer is no. It's a low number, but it's not low risk. Severe icing is a high risk, and all flight manuals prohibit aircraft from flying in known severe icing conditions, which means when we trend this information, we're coming to the wrong conclusions. And the reason why is, let's look at our magic Fratomatic, which will explain why. So the process of transforming those hazards into numbers destroys information. And by looking at the number, we have no idea what that number represents. For example, does it represent strong crosswinds at non-tower airports and fatigue? Or does it represent narrow runway and icy conditions in mountainous terrain? And the distinction is critically important because what matters is not saying you know the number associated with the hazard. Once again, it's what actions are you going to take to mitigate the risk. And each of those hazards I just mentioned require different risk mitigation procedures. Those procedures are not identified by a simple number. And the reason numbers don't make sense is, let's go to the 5th hidden danger, is the empirical illusion, right? The belief that because we're using numbers, therefore it's objective, but it's really not. Numbers are used in a subjective way. Using the system is subjective. And the reason is the empirical illusion, right? And the reason we cannot add hazards and risks together is there's no such thing as a fundamental risk unit. Right? We can't say 2 3-star restaurants are better than a 5-star restaurant because 3 + 3 is 6 and 6 is greater than 5. It makes no sense. We can do it with dollars because a dollar is a fundamental unit. But there are no such things as fundamental risk units, which means we cannot add that together. And why is all this important? I know it really is about going more than just compliance. I had a personal experiences that really highlighted these hidden dangers, and it was for many years ago when I was flying this aircraft in the Air Force, which is a special operations helicopter called the MH-53. And one night I was flying a training flight. I was a brand new pilot in command. I was flying a training flight with a relatively inexperienced co-pilot. And we're flying at night, which meant we were wearing night vision goggles. Night vision goggles, they simply amplify ambient light. You need a light source like stars or moon for them to really be effective. And the night we were flying, we had an overcast cloud deck, so the sky and the sea blended together. Our mission was to drop off a SEAL team somewhere in the ocean. And my co-pilot is at the controls flying towards the horizon, and we're flying at 50 feet. I was the non-flying pilot, so my job is to back them up. So we're flying along, and I briefly look down to check the status on our mission computer. And as soon as I go heads down, 2 seconds later, he called out spatial D, which meant he was spatially disoriented. He didn't know what it was up. So I quickly looked up, I cross-checked our instruments and saw we were at 30 degrees angle of bank descending through about 25 feet on the radar altimeter. And for perspective, the rotor diameter of the helicopter from tip to tip is about 70 feet. So we're less than half a rotor away from hitting the water. So I grabbed the controls, I climbed up, and we continued and landed uneventfully. But looking back on this, we asked the question, why did this happen? And it happened because we didn't know what we didn't know. I was too inexperienced of a PIC to really be aware of some of those challenges that my new co-pilot faced. But before this flight, like good little Air Force pilots, we went to our flight planning room, we got our little FRAT score, we got our number, and it almost cost me and our crew our lives. That number was worthless. What we needed were actions. What actions could we have taken to mitigate risk? This is what would have been effective, right? Beware of spatial disorientation for overwater missions. What do you need to do? Minimize head movement, maintain your cross-check, increase your minimum altitudes. This is tangible actions that we can take to mitigate risk. And this is the impetus for creating that next generation risk assessment, which is flight risk, which is organizing information, as Madeline talked about, and make it digestible by phase of flight. So what's important is not a number, it's what actions are we going to take to mitigate risk. And that is the important takeaway whenever you think of using any type of risk assessment methodology. Madeline?
Thank you, Chris. So just to wrap things up here, we just have a couple of quick final thoughts. And there are 3 of them. The first one here is that pre-work risk assessments are grounded in SMS risk management fundamentals. Your workers don't necessarily need to know that. We can bake these processes into their work, into their routines, to the extent where they realize the value enough that they don't necessarily care where the practices came from or why they exist. It kind of almost becomes an afterthought in that regard. Next is that hazard identification and dialogue are critical to a successful mission. Now, of course, dialogue is necessary, but as Chris talked about, it's not only dialogue before the event, but also that briefing at the end that can somehow make its way back to the next risk assessment. And if there isn't, if you personally in your operation don't have a technical way of ensuring that, that even further enhances the need for dialogue, because that's where that information is going to present itself, right? Through our experience, through sense making of our environment based on things that we have experienced or heard or are aware of through other means, whether it was because of ourselves or something that we read or something of that nature. And then finally, what we like to refer to this as at Polaris is 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And that alludes to everything that Chris just talked about, right? When you add up these scores, even though, you know, the math might work out to equal 2, that isn't very indicative of the real risks that we're seeing. And it doesn't give us a whole lot of information. That number doesn't give us a whole lot of information to make better decisions about risk mitigation and next steps and so on. So with that being said, we're going to end it here and open it up for questions. Back to you, Catherine.
All right, thank you so much, Madeline and Chris. It's great to have you both discussing this and bringing up things that I know I've heard over the years, time and time again, about the numbers. And boy, the emphasis on tools that create dialogue, I think, is fantastic. A couple of questions here. One is has to do with line and maintenance departments, and it's basically line and maintenance departments have a lot less hard data compared to flight departments. Could you go into more detail about how this modern method could still work for them, that you're talking about that in light of the differences?
Absolutely. So I'll speak to our technology a little bit. One of the reasons, because we just launched a brand new ground risk application, which mimics basically what we saw with flight risk in the general sense of the ability to provide advisories and such. So we've mimicked this for ground risk, and you're absolutely right. The inputs, I think I actually have a slide here. The flight risk inputs are greater. So on the left-hand side there, you can see all of the different data structures that we generally can pull from, right? So scheduling information, departure, arrival locations, dates, times, crew members and their positions, what regulatory rules you're flying under. So Part 91, 135, 121. What aircraft information do we have about the aircraft model, all of that stuff, all the way to METARs and TAFs, NOTAMs, airfield and runway data, risk ratings, also other experience that you can put into flight risk that can present itself back on the risk assessment. So there are a lot of inputs for crew, absolutely. And then on the maintenance and ground side, there's a lot less in that regard, right? So we do still have schedule information to some extent, right? Dates, times, locations, facilities, technicians. We can also start to classify work and work activities. So what type of work are you doing? Are you repairing something? Are you fueling? Are you defueling, right? We can categorize these activities. We can also account for the type of equipment that we're working with or working on, and we can also track operational health and safety factors associated with these work activities and with the aircraft and equipment, such as this specific activity requires PPE because you're working with hazmat. This other activity requires that you work from an elevated surface. So you can build a lot of these profiles into our software, for example, and then we can pull in other sources such as weather data and analyze that. So how do you manage these fewer inputs? And one of the reasons we wanted to have this discussion today is because it further drives this whole concept of having dialogue, because just as there are fewer inputs for our own technology between flight crew and maintenance ground technicians, it's the exact same for if you were to utilize a traditional FRAT, right? Any of these numbers, there's just less data to consider. So the significance of dialogue is really critical there. We want to pull from your past experience. We want to account for all of the qualifications and certifications and things like that that we already know, but we need to account for these other less tangible, less data-driven things. And because there's less data, further drives that need for discussion and dialogue. So it's a little bit of an not a wishy-washy response, if you will, but it's a little bit more abstract in a certain sense. But that's the whole reason, again, we're having the conversation. It's because it absolutely is, and we can't face abstractness with these rigid structures, right? It doesn't actually propel us forward in managing risk.
Yeah, a question just came up is kind of related to this, so it might just be restating things, but as you know, the title encompasses the maintenance risk assessment, and just any thoughts about tools that are being developed specifically for maintenance assessment in light of what you just said?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and as I touched on, so of course you have the traditional, what you would see here as a traditional FRAT on your screen. I think I have a better visual here. I'll pull up. We'll look at this one here. So obviously this applies to flight departments. I've seen it applied to maintenance departments. Obviously, you can change the the hazards that you see in here wouldn't always apply to maintenance, right? So you can change these up. You can find templates for this, and you can modify this, and that's certainly one fairly straightforward approach that uses the traditional FRAT method. As it relates to this next generation method that we've kind of been alluding to, that Chris was talking about with these advisories and capturing this information and driving discussion, the only tool I'm aware of so far that fits this next gen methodology is our new ground risk tool. So if you go to our Polaris Aero website, you can see some images of that, and feel free to reach out to us and we can give you a demo. But essentially what it's meant to do is take in your schedule, so you can populate it with the activities that you're doing, who is doing those activities, what aircraft are you working on, what types of aircraft movements are involved. You can build these activity profiles so that you pretty much know all of the different hazards associated with an activity that you would need to be aware of. So that's the first element, that's populating the data side. And then on the back end, you can develop these rules around a combination of factors, right? So I have I have ground technician Chris working with maintenance technician Madeline, and them working together on this aircraft requires a special advisory because maybe Madeline is still in training and requires an IA to sign off on her work, right? So can provide those advisories. It can say, you know, hey, this activity was completed last week, and when it was done last week, we identified these different hazards that you need to be aware of the next time you do that activity. So you're able to build in this knowledge into the actual technology to display on your risk assessment the next time that a relevant activity or technician or so on and so forth show up on that risk assessment. So I'm going to pause there actually and see if Chris has anything he wants to add, or I think even Steve, if you want to jump in, you're welcome to. And if not, Catherine, go ahead.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you for that. And I think I just added a link to the resources page for Polaris Aero where there's information about the ground ground risk. Yeah, you guys have been busy with this. So, and another question, are there any best practices or real world examples you can share to highlight the importance of line service and maintenance risk assessment tools in ensuring overall safety in aviation operations?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And a lot of this is coming secondhand because our product in particular is so new that we're still gaining momentum in that sense and seeing what the data is pulling back to us. But certain examples, might be around collaborating on, troubleshooting of an aircraft, of a specific aircraft on using a specific maintenance code, right? So again, in our software, you can build in what part of the aircraft you're working on. By identifying the aircraft tail number, we know what model that aircraft is. And so I've seen the applicability there where you have a specific technician working on a specific part of the aircraft based on the ATA code or the JAS code, and it return an advisory just about, this particular aircraft doesn't have very well documented guidance on how to actually access this component that you're actually trying to fix. So here are some things that you need to consider when doing that. And that might seem fairly abstract, but the point of that is when you are going about your daily business, you might not necessarily know where all of the risks lie. A lack of information certainly is risky in and of itself. And so by giving this information back to a maintenance technician of, hey, there's generally a lack of guidance around this procedure. Here's what we did in the past that worked well. You're still building up that information and that knowledge base of that technician so that they can move forward with their work in a more efficient and in a safer manner, where they may not necessarily put themselves in a situation where they've accessed a part of the aircraft that wasn't supposed to be maintained or could have been avoided because of this this procedure around around the piece. So that's one example that I've seen. Again, I know a fairly intangible, but we've seen it on the line side too, particularly as it relates to fueling of different types of aircraft. I know DEF, diesel exhaust fluid, has been a big concern for the last, gosh, I don't know, 10 years, as far as I'm concerned, probably even longer than that. And these issues continue to persist. So you can bake in these advisories that, hey, when you're fueling your fuel truck from the fuel farm, or if you know that you're going to have to add PRIS to it or whatever, again, you build in these activities and you can create advisories around, hey, when you complete this activity, here's a reminder. DEF is in with the blue lid and PRIS is in, the white container. Make sure you use the right container, right? It's just these extra pieces of information and reminders that can be extremely useful in a very timely manner. And that's, I think, the emphasis we didn't put a lot on today, but that's absolutely, something that needs to be emphasized.
That's great. Thank you for that. Here's another interesting one. We currently use a traditional FRAT, but would like to modernize our approach. How can we get people on board?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple different ways that you can do this. One way is just by circulating this video, right? Because it talks a little bit more about the psychology behind things, about the regulation and the standard behind all of this, but also gives some practical reasons as to why a modern methodology would be more appropriate. So that's one fairly obvious example for me. You can also put the questions back on your workers. Ask them what works and doesn't work for them in the way that they're currently doing their work. Our frontline employees are very insightful if we can get them to communicate back with us and get their input, not only on what works and what doesn't work, but what ideas do you have that can make this better? And that just gets people thinking. You may not necessarily get to the end result that you desire of everyone's now on board with this new methodology, but at least you're seeding those thoughts and getting people to think about it on a more, hopefully on a more routine basis. The other thing you can do is communicate that, this modern approach is meant to give you essentially more control in a way. It allows you to have more of to allow for more of a deference to your expertise. In the past, I've seen at certain operators utilizing a traditional FRAT, almost too much of a culture is designed around that, where it's so number focused that any additional information you try to bring to the conversation can kind of be disregarded. It's like, well, here's what the number said. The numbers say you should go, so you should go, or the numbers say you shouldn't go, when you feel like, hey, these risks can be mitigated to the extent where I think we're okay, right? So it affords you the opportunity to have more decision making.
Yeah.
Not reduce it, I guess is the point I'm trying to make there.
Yeah, if so you're in the transition and you want to modernize, but you have to stay with the traditional one for now, are there any suggestions for improving it without changing the method immediately?
Yeah, good question. I think the key thing you can do with that is make sure that if you're using that traditional tool, that people understand it is not the end all be all, right? It is a tool in the greater process of risk assessment. So utilize the tool as a starting point, use it as a launching point, get the juices flowing, make sure you're covering the things you need to cover, from qualifications to situational awareness factors and things of that nature, right? Everything that we looked at on the FRAT before, but emphasize that this is not it. This is not the end all be all, and we still want to rely on the knowledge and information that all of the individuals can bring to the conversation.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to put the contact page, the web for you. There you go. Thank you for that. I was going to say, there's one question about integration with other applications like ForeFlight, and I don't know if you want to address that here, but I just put the Polaris contact page, and you put up the next. I'll talk about that in a second. The next SafetyNet. So I would guess that probably the best way to approach integration and things like that is to just, it's a little off topic for today, but to give you all a touch base with you guys, either phone or email. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Since
absolutely.
that's a bigger conversation.
Yeah. To quickly answer the question, we are integrated with ForeFlight Dispatch. On the maintenance and ground side, we're pursuing opportunities for integration. That's a little bit trickier in some sense, but we'll save that conversation for another day.
All right, perfect. So yes, next up, I also put the link to the next Polaris Aero SafetyNet, talking about best practices to transition to a new safety officer with Kelly Roby. So looking forward to that, Madeline. Chris, thank you so much again for your expertise and insights about this. It's just fantastic to see this risk assessment process expanding to all areas of an operation and to the benefits that we get from the technology that you all have developed. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about the new products, and that'll be another conversation we'll have as well. And so thank you all for being here and joining us at this at today's SafetyNet webinar. Those of you who attended live, this is eligible for NBA CAM credit, and you don't have to do anything to get it. I will take care of that. And I hope we see you on November 30th for the transition to a new safety officer discussion. And Madeline, Chris, we will see you all again soon. Everyone have a great rest of your day and fly safe. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.